Good afternoon, everybody. It's Lunch and Learn. It is January 20th, Wednesday. We're going to unmute everybody. Today, Richard will be doing a follow-up on the bipolar montage talk that he started last week. And then we will be scheduling, I think it's next Wednesday or so, he'll do the talk on proportional training. But for today, we're working on bipolar montage. So, Richard, great stuff. It's all
Okay,
yours. Once you get
great.
everybody unmuted.
I'm just about got everybody
Oh,
unmuted. So
oh,
in
okay,
case
gotcha.
somebody wants to add a question or comment as we go. Okay, so I did part one of this last week, and Jordan posted it right away. So it's up there if you want to go see it. And the point we're making is that the new mind protocols are all monopolar montage. None of the new mind protocols are bipolar. They're all monopolar montage. And when you do brain mapping, that's all monopolar montage. So when you compare your trend screens to your maps, if you're ever looking at the values, they'll match up and it'll make sense. But if you're using bipolar montage, your amplitudes are going to be considerably less. Um, and we'll show you that in a minute, but there's a reason why your amplitudes are considerably less in bipolar montage. Bipolar montage, it goes in and out of fashion since the 70s. It got used a lot more in the 70s and 80s because with EEG, because the amplifiers were so poor that there'd be just so much artifact that one of the best ways to block it out was with a bipolar montage. Of course, a lot of people at the time didn't really understand what bipolar montage was doing in terms of the electronics and in terms of the brain, and we still don't know that much about what it's doing in terms of the brain. And they just naively assumed it was similar to monopolar, except the amplitude was a little lower. But back in those days, we also had people using things like root mean square values instead of peak-to-peak values for calculating amplitude. So that was another monkey wrench in it. So people were talking apples to oranges and grapefruits all day long, and nobody could figure out why they couldn't agree. And it was because they weren't all using the same measurements. They were using different methods and different measurements, and they didn't realize at the time because not everybody was that well trained. Today, we're better trained, and you are fine using just monopolar. There's no reason you have to go, afield and use bipolar. It's an option for those who've really kind of mastered monopolar and are looking for something else to explore, or for those who are just to get up against a wall with a client and want to just try something really different. There's typically no danger in doing it or anything like that. It's just that it could cause you confusion unless you're really well established in neurofeedback. So I wouldn't go chasing down monopolar protocols until you spend a year or two doing neurofeedback. If I were you, I think you could get very confused, but I'll leave that up to you. So last week, we just went over real quick what a differential amplifier was, and then we talked about how to hook up a bipolar montage on the new mind trainer, because certain steps you have to take, both with the hardware and the software to do it. But we built the software on purpose a certain way so you could do this, because we eventually figured, fashions come and go, it would come back again. And then we showed you a typical a bipolar montage that's used for trauma. For instance, Seaburn Fisher uses this kind of montage for trauma, but other people use it too. The difference is that Seaburn Fisher came along at a time when the Othmers were doing an unusual type of training. And so there's a lot of people doing T4P4, but they're using the old Othmer technique of doing a weak broad squash across all frequencies and then a narrow band of uptraining 3 hertz wide that you shift up and down. And I still think there's a lot of interesting promise in that approach, but it had such strong effects on at the brainstem level that the side effects were disarming to people. You know, it'd be worth it to investigate it someday and see if there's a way to avoid so many side effects. But at the moment, everybody moved on. The authors went into training just frequencies mostly below 1 hertz, and uh, other people apparently, you know, based on what I'm hearing from the workshops that Seaburn's doing these days, she's just inhibiting 1 to 6 hertz, and the higher frequencies up maybe like 20 to 30. And how exact you have to be, there's no research on that. That's just, it's like Rob says, well, I have preferences and I use this because it seems to work in my experience. We all have clinical preferences. Seaburn's is 1 to 6 and then maybe 20 to 30 or something like that. But there's nothing written in stone about that. There's no big danger that you would have changing those bands a little bit. And you might get improvements with each client because everybody's a little bit different. It's not a big danger to shift a band a little bit up and down to try to get a better result. We've heard Martin saying, well, I like to train SMR at a slightly lower frequency range. And that's fine, and Rob may not. Martin doesn't probably know it because he's not a big consumer of research all day and all night, or junkie like me, but there is support for Martin's ideas, and people have been doing what Martin was suggesting 20 years ago. We were notching down 13 to 15 and notching it up, looking for if it would make a difference and the person would do better. But sleep spindles, which SMR basically are, they shift with age. They're down slightly lower. They're down around 12.5 hertz if you're a 4-year-old, maybe 12 hertz if you're 3, and they go up to 15 hertz as adults, but generally they're between 12 and 14 on average. But then if you go frontally, there is sleep spindles frontally, and they're much lower. They go down into 11 and 10 hertz. So location makes a difference, as does shifting your filter. And that's why I say, don't be afraid to shift a little bit once you get sophisticated. You know, change your reinforcements a little bit, shift your filter a little bit, you know, and that's okay. But we don't like to see people do it right out of the starting gate because everybody's so confused to begin with. And most of the time, just using the standard filters works fine. Wait till you get more sophisticated. So we talked about that filter setup and how you might do that more complex one. And so that's all on, that discussion's on there, and Judy gave input on that based on her attendance to the workshops Seaburn's done. So you can get all that by doing part 1. So let's go back to the differential amplifier and see why bipolar is different. And again, we're using a differential amplifier, in modern times it's an instrumental amp. It uses 2 op amplifiers, which are really super good at rejecting noise. They're very high impedance. That's why you don't need so much paste, and all the signals are so much better these days. You get less artifact. They're much more accurate, and you're putting your active lead from on one location, and the reference lead you're not putting on the ground, you're putting on another location, and then you're hooking your ear clip to the ground in the amplifier. And again, we went all over that hookup. But what happens when you do this, and Tom talks about this a bit in his book on technical foundations, but I was surprised he didn't get into it more. So he's kind of become a monopolar guy too. This is what happens if you have voltages, different voltages going into those op amps. There it is. There's one side of the op amp is where that 7 is. So that would be the active, and then the other side of the op amp here is 0, and that would be at the reference. Okay, so we have one location F4 going to 7 microvolts and one location at C4 going to 0. That's happening when your software is saying you're getting 7 microvolts. So if you were setting your software to uptrain, you said, I want it to uptrain beta, or let's just say SMR, that's a popular one, and the SMR goes up to 7 microvolts. Well, that would be bad because that would mean there was a lot of artifact in there. Shouldn't go up over 6. But let's say you get up to 6 or 7. You don't know what the voltage value at F4 or C4 is, technically, unless you're being very careful about which side of the amp you're hooking up. And people do that. They'll say, oh, I'm going to do F4 minus C4. If you're really consistent, then you can read better what's going on your screen. And then when you're uptraining, you're actually uptraining. So, but it's a little bit like the wave function. You get 7 microvolts, you don't know what your voltages are here exactly, you know. And then they could both, you could be seeing everything going down and saying, oh, good, well, for a while it was up at 7, now SMR is down, we've got to get it back up. But in fact, the SMR at F4 and C4 now are both at 7. They're high, but you're thinking, oh, they're really low. And your software is saying, oh, they're really low. So your software is misreading the input from these things. And if F4 goes to 7 microvolts and C4 goes to minus 7 microvolts, well, you'll get really high readings. You'll think like, oh my God, SMR is up at 14 microvolts. So you can get much bigger swings, but much lower overall amplitude, and you don't know what's going on. And your software is not correctly reading your bipolar montage. I mean, that's what theory suggests. Anybody have a question on that? Yeah, it's just a little bit disturbing. You're not really sure. Tom would tell you that when downtraining amplitude, either phase difference can decrease or synchrony in both areas can decrease. So what's going on is not only that the amplitudes may vary, but phase and coherence relationships may vary, and you might not see those in the amplitude. So if you're thinking like, how in God's name would you know what's going on, and how would your software know for sure? You'd be thinking correctly. It's like, oh my God, it's so complex that, and it doesn't record properly in the software. Why do it? Well, it was working for people and they didn't know all this stuff. So when we downtrain, we are moving toward phase synchrony in many cases, since we are reducing amplitude in both electrodes simultaneously. When uptraining, we're moving away from phase synchrony and increasing the phase angle between the signals. We're dephasing. Now, if your eyes are crossing, that's okay. We could be talking about positive and up and down spin in electrons orbits in the quantum model. I mean, it's that confusing, that crazy. We don't know what we're getting. In this case, even when we measure it, we don't know what we're getting unless we're using sophisticated equipment. And that happens, you know, with people and technology. There's a problem here, though, with the theory. And that theory is based upon electronics. And most electronic networks are basically passive unless you design them to be reactive. And you can do that by adding coils and things like that. But they're way more passive than the brain. The brain is intelligent and the brain reacts back. And the brain is a self-balancing allostatic system. It tries to balance the dynamics. It has to. It has a certain range of function, and it can't go outside that range of function, or you'll go into seizure or you'll go into a coma. So your brain is always balancing you between seizure and coma with all of these constraints, you know, what the neurotransmitters are doing and the networks are doing to constrain each other. And so it's not passive, it's very active and it's very intelligent. In fact, in some ways it's more intelligent than you are because you're just using, you can't run your body, but your brain can. So if you think about that for a minute, you're like, wait a second, I can't operate all this body systems, what my brain does. I guess that means my brain knows more about what's going on with me than I do. So where is that brain? And it's like, well, that's called your unconscious or your subliminal processing. Shows up in your dreams sometimes. Um, so the brain's acting against, over and against this theoretical thing that you're pushing it with the bipolar montage. So, you know, in the old days, they were saying, well, bipolar reduces artifact, trains more regionally. It's not as local because you've got two sensors on two different areas. It's difficult to interpret. Well, I think I made that point. And it correlates poorly with the EEG. Um, so Monopolar has some more artifact, but now we have auto artifacting, trains more locally. Most of us like that. It's very site specific. It's way easier to interpret the results, and it correlates with your EEG. So this is why in NewMind, we shifted over to monopolar, because we wanted to make a standardized system that was very accurate, where we could save the data, whether it's in the clinic or in the cloud, and run statistics on it, or just look at it as a clinician and evaluate it and know that, what you're measuring is what was happening. But I actually went and did some experiments, hooked people up with a brain map cap, and then I took a couple of brain master amplifiers, and we trained them with a monopolar, I take that back. We trained them with a bipolar setup, and then we, with one brain master amp, and then we monitored them with a monopolar. I think I actually may have used two. At another look at the locations we're training at, we monitored them in monopolar to see if you trained with bipolar, what would the brainmaster monopolar look like? And then we actually did brain maps of the whole process as over time. And then we cut it into short, like 15-second segments, and analyzed each segment to see dynamically what the brain was doing. I mean, it took time, and somebody should have done this 20 years before I did it, and I don't know why they didn't, but clinicians are clinicians, they're not researchers. That's probably why. And what we found out is that the theory didn't predict what was going to happen. So I'll tell you what, that raised some eyebrows at ISNR when I showed them the data, because I had empirical data. They were just saying, oh, it's going to be this or it's going to do this. And they never checked. They never did an experiment to see, does it do this? What's the empirical event? So it was a good hypothesis because it's testable. Modern science, that's the criteria of a good hypothesis. Is it testable? And so we tested it. And this is interesting. So down here is PZC4 bipolar montage. First it's going down, then it's gradually going up, goes down a little, and it keeps going up. So they're getting better and better at getting this up. Well, if they're getting better and better at getting it up, does that mean that PZ, or well, let's say they're doing PZC4, does that mean that C4 is going down to zero a lot? Or does it mean the other option? If you're up training, are we getting one side really up and one side really down? Or are we getting shifts in phases and coherence? Well, let's see. So here's monopolar monitoring. Yeah, I used 3 brain masters. I used, that's probably why most clinicians didn't do it. They didn't have 3 brain master amps kicking around. So I trained this up here with bipolar, and then I monitored each location with monopolar. And isn't it interesting? But the general trend is up. So what you would expect to occur based on the theory is wrong. When you train up with bipolar montage, it actually goes up. Now you'll also notice that we're getting like 4 microvolts going down to 2 and up to 5. Whereas monopolar, we're seeing 11 going up to 14. So there's your difference in amplitude. So that is true, you know. So it does mean that we're getting cancellation effects in terms of phase, coherence, with respect to amplitude. You know, when one side's of the amp's going up, the other side's going down, and vice versa, we're losing power. So if you decide to do bipolar training, know that your power is going to be way down. It's almost like 3 times lower than what you're seeing here. The general trend is generally the same. Now, why would that be? Well, when we looked at the brain maps and we looked at the actual dynamics in real time in 15-second sliding windows, what we found is because the brain was doing a push-pull. What's happening is this guy goes 7, then this side goes 7, then this side goes 7, then this side goes 7. So you're actually getting it shifting through all possibilities, and it's doing it rapidly. And every time it shifts, it goes slightly higher. So the grand average tends to increase. Now, the only way I would know that is that when you're looking at the brain map, you can see C4 going up and then C4 going down while PZ goes up, and then vice versa. So they're like on a seesaw going back and forth. If you had a coherence problem and you had too much high or low coherence, you might be able to shake up that stuck coherence, unstick the coherence. You may be able to exercise coherence and phase and get changes. And so there's a good chance that people found that bipolar training was being quite effective. And why they called it the poor man's coherence training is because that's exactly what it was doing. Talking to the owner of Lexicor, you get a sense that he knew that. And a few other people in neurofeedback actually understood that. And I think Joe Lubar did too, to some degree, but a lot of people didn't. And they published ideas contrary to this that this refuted. So I had some people go out and said, well, I guess I'll have to tear up my article. And I said, well, sorry, but we had to sort this out. Now here's monopolar phase and monopolar coherence. Now, if we look at this, you can see I left, let's see, I believe this is blue. Yeah, I left this in. It should be the same. It's been 15 years since I went over this. This is the same. Here's their bipolar magnitude. And then here's monopolar coherence. And then there we have the monopolar magnitude. So actually what we've done is we've just taken this chart and added in the phase going here, and we've added in the coherence. Now, these vary between 0 and 100%, and these are probably up higher on the chart. I did this in Excel so I could overlay the phase and the coherence so you could see the pattern. This over here only doesn't represent the actual values, but the up and down does map on, it perfectly correlates with the actually phase and coherence, so that you can see the pattern of phase and coherence regardless of the values. So looking at that, you can see that when we're training up here and down here, look at this. The coherence is generally following the amplitude. Well, that suggests that coherence is fairly stable, and that's not the dimension that changes that much over time during bipolar training. But look at the phase. It's in light blue, and it is bucking the system. It comes down, it follows it a bit, and then it comes down, following down here. This is going up, even though this is going down. So we do have some disagreement, and you would expect that if here is the amplitude going down, but the bipolar is going up. And since coherence is staying the same, something has to give. So what gives is phase. It reverses direction. And we see that again here. Both coherence and bipolar training are going up. And so something has to give. And what gives is coherence. Phase. Even I get mixed up here. So, but basically what you can see is that in particular, phase is the place that changes if coherence and amplitude are all going up. So the dynamics that theory predicts are there, but the actual way they behave in real time is way more complex. And we would have to build much more complex software and train with 4 channels to predict what we're doing. And we may do that in time with NewMind, but right now we just want to finish up the work we're doing with Monopolar and measuring outcomes and all of that. And we're getting there. And we've thought it was more important to implement proportional training because of the research that was done with mind over chatter, and because it had been very effective in peak performance training in the research going back 20 years. And so we did that. And then we jumped to coherence training because of all the really powerful work that Coben had done with multivariate coherence. And we thought that was something. This is a lot more vague, a lot more gray area, and requires a lot more study and investigation to really track. Okay, so and we kind of covered all this already. So any comments or questions, hypotheses, speculations? Anybody still hearing me? Did I lose everybody?
Oh, we're hearing you.
Okay, good.
Yeah. You're good.
Quick question, Richard. I'm Martin here. I'm of course fascinated by the studies you made with several brain masters and trying to compare them. Did you have a special cap where you could actually connect to 2 amplifiers simultaneously, or did you have to do it sequentially?
You're talking about when we did the bipolar training itself?
Compared the 2 training.
I see where you're going, Martin.
How did you do that technically?
Well, in a sense we did because we wanted to see the impact of using how the amplifier was interacting with the software and what the outcome was on the screen. And then we wanted to have a single amp on each of the locations.
No, I didn't make myself clear.
Okay.
This graph here, you compare the 2 methods of training, right? So, and you said you check this actually out that's fascinating. I would love to do things like that as well. So my question is, how did you do that technically? I mean, if you have someone with a cap on, that cap has just 1 output.
Yeah.
How did you do that then?
Well, because we had 3 amplifiers, we had it was a mess, Martin. The ears on all, and we did this with several subjects, so it wasn't just one subject. We had so many ear clips on everybody's ears that they looked like a pincushion.
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah, and we had to make sure we didn't get any bridging with the pace between all the ear clips. It was a trick getting all that. Thank God everybody had lots of big ears in this group. So we had all 3 Brainmaster amps, going to each of those locations, and we had to be careful. We couldn't get precisely the same location because we had to avoid bridging there as well. And we had to measure the scalp exactly. We were using calipers so that when we put the cap on, we had to make sure that we weren't getting bridging between the cap and the other sensors. So actually, the cap was on the precise locations, but these sensors were slightly off the location, but it was within the range of the dipole output, from the mid layers. We knew that we were getting the same dipole groups mostly. So
Yeah.
it was
So if
tricky.
I understand you correctly, you had sensors and the cap. So you
Yes.
could connect to it. Okay, so you did actually simultaneous survey. Yeah, okay, that answers my question. Wow.
Uh,
Wow, compliments.
yeah, I had to sit down and think about it for a long time, and I had to ask Siegfried a lot of questions. And what did his math mean? Because he's a physicist, he was writing down the equations. I said, well, what's this equation? What's this? And he explained it to me, and then I went and I set up everything, and then I knew what he was driving at. And I said, I'm going to see if you're right. And he said, okay, go ahead. And then I showed him that it was wrong. And he went, well, the equations are right. And I said, yes, but you're working with a brain that pushes back. And he said, that makes sense.
Yeah, plus equipment, and how to collect the data. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for clearing this.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that we don't always think about. And if you're a clinician, I mean, mostly you're not interested in this stuff. It's just some of us who just have to know, who want to play around with this stuff. But I just happen to have a lot of amplifiers. I was lucky. You couldn't do that without all these amplifiers and stuff.
Yeah, and they have to be the same make and
They have to be exactly same make, same model, using the same software,
same sensors.
Yep. Same style sensors, same amount of paste on everything, same kind of paste, same kind of prep. Everything has to be exactly the same as you can, and then getting the cap not to
disrupt the sensors underneath. Yeah,
that drove us nuts. It would take a couple of hours to get it set up, and then we had to make sure that the person, wasn't just falling dead asleep on us by that time. And it was painful. People would have to keep those caps on for a long time while we got it set up. But it shows you can. I mean, if you really think about it, any of us can do research things like this in our clinics. We just usually don't think about it. And I think the more that you're trained to do research, the more likely you are to think about doing it. And the less you're trained, you're like, yeah, I'm more interested in helping people. It's just totally understandable. But this gives us good information. It allows us solid information to move forward. I have the maps on all this. And I did the same thing with photic stimulation. We would run different people, different frequencies of photic stimulation, record the maps, break them down, analyze, different segments of the session, and then compare it to their base brain map, and then compare it to when they're training. And, you do that and you get some good information about what's going on. But there's just too much in our field where people would say, well, theoretically it should be doing this, and then assume that's the case, and you can't until you test. And that's kind of what we all do clinically. And it's understandable because we don't have the resources. And sometimes what you observe on your software and stuff, if you're thinking about it right, is accurate, and you are seeing what you're seeing. But a lot of times people make up theories about what they're seeing, and they're not testing them, and the theories are wrong. And then we have these myths that get circulated, and then people they'll die on their sword for the myth. I remember seeing people stand up and saying, well, if you don't scrub people's foreheads until they bleed and get it down below 5 k ohms, then when you're doing neurofeedback, it's unethical. And I'm like, these people have no background in electronics, and they don't have a clue what they're talking about, but they just came to believe it because somebody in authority said it. And so that's why I'm a real fan of checking out who's talking to you and where did they get their information. I mean, and that's why we're in such big trouble in our country right now. You really have to nail people down. If they say something, well, where is that coming from? How do you know that? Don't just believe them because they have a big name in the field. Don't just believe me because I've been around in the field and I've been talking all this stuff. You know, ask me if you have a question and I'll say, well, check it out. It's written here or it's in the research here. So don't be afraid to use bipolar. Just know what you don't know. You know, going into the unknown is fine, but just be aware of what you don't know when you're doing it. Otherwise, it'll bite you later.
So Richard, I'm a new clinician and just trying to make sense of the data on the screen. Am I understanding that if I don't want to do bipolar yet as a new clinician, am I understanding that I could use the monopolar coherence as a way to basically get the same sorts of results?
Actually, you could, and you would have more information about what you're doing, and it would be more accurate.
Okay.
Just to a degree. And here's the problem with that. We don't know when you train coherence what the exact amplitude model is. If we're training amplitude, we know at this point we have an idea what the dynamic outcome is. And that's tentative because we did it with 3 people. We did a good job, but it hasn't been replicated, you know, until what I did is replicated a few times. We just have to say, well, tentatively, it seems like this is what goes on. Nobody's done that to my knowledge with coherence and then monitored the amplitude variations and said, yes, it's the same in reverse. I would expect it is because it's a fairly tight system, but I can't say for sure. But one thing I can say for sure, if you train coherence, you will shake it up just as much as you would shake it up doing bipolar training. The difference is that you would have more precise control over which direction the coherence and phase was going. Now, to understand what direction it was going in, you'd have to kind of hang out in the field for another year studying coherence and phase. So that's why I say don't jump into multivariate coherence training right away. Don't jump into bipolar right away. Just stick with the basic standard, well-established single and 2-channel neurofeedback protocol that we've been using effectively for 20 years, and that's well-grounded in research and case studies. Don't be afraid you're missing the boat here. That's what I always wanted to say to everybody, Rhonda. I think proportional training is something you could jump into much earlier than multivariate coherence because you're just using slightly different methods to train magnitude, which we're doing, and it's a monopolar thing, and so it's all in the same paradigm, and it's very powerful. But multivariate coherence training, I would wait a while before you jump into that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. Great question.
You know, wait a second. I'm sorry, I'm on 2.
Yeah.
Shoot. Because I lost my volume. I couldn't hear you in the middle of your answering the question. Everything that you talk about today, for the first 2 years that I did neurofeedback, was absolute Greek to me. I could not absorb conceptually a lot of what you're saying. It just didn't make sense. And so I did mostly all monopolar because there was a lot of research behind it, and I knew I could just follow the research and what you said and be efficient and effective in what I did with people. And really only in the last year and a half that some of the bipolar started to make me very curious. And even now, when I sit with somebody and tell them, give them a verbal evaluation of the QEEG, what I would do, I present it, if I'm going to even talk about bipolar conceptually, I almost have two different conversations with them, because like you say, you can't look at your screen to determine if this is working. You really can't. It is absolutely done with conversations with the people and the therapy that you're doing with the people, versus when we talk about the monopolar, what we're doing. Okay, so now we're going to work on focus. I'm going to put leads in the front, and we're going to repeat this again and again. I mean, and the conversation is so much different. Where when I'm talking about bipolar possibilities, it's the strong conversation. I mean, I will often tell people it's like the old-fashioned radios that we're trying to tune, where you can hear the station, but there's so much static, and I probably didn't originate that. I probably heard it here on a Lunch and Learn or somewhere, but that we're tuning it. And so I feel in a way like I'm floating in water when I do the bipolar, and I feel like I'm standing on firm ground when I do the monopolar, in all honesty. But the effects I've been getting with bipolar are very strong.
Yeah,
in,
they are.
in helping people who have not been helped by many other things.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, Judy, I would say to people getting into the field right away, there's no problem with doing bipolar, except that most of the people are so confused about how the hookup is.
I could never have done this in the beginning.
Well, that's what
And
I'm saying.
I would advise it at all until you're really standing firmly in the work that you do, using monopolar, and understand and can can see it better. And you're not,
Yeah.
you look at the map and you can come up with, for example, what protocols do you want to use? And then you can check it with what the map puts out, but that you have an idea because you're interpreting. I would not go to bipolar with any speed at all, personally. And sometimes this is my personal opinion, but I'm with Richard. When you talk about the research and everything that goes with it, I stand behind that. It seems that the people that have been coming, some of them have tried so much to feel better, and in spite of their best efforts. And that's usually when I'll work in the bipolar range.
Mm-hmm.
When they present it to me in such a way that it says, okay, so let's see what happens here. And I always precede it with SMR at CZ. I just
Mm-hmm.
might go 7 to 14 instead of 12 to 15, and I'll do 8 to 10 of those just to get started that way before. And I heard what you said the other day, that the restaurant of the day, and that made sense as well, because I heard what you say, that you think alpha theta can do as well as bipolar,
For
and
trauma, yes.
for trauma, right. Which is really the only time I'm using bipolar, is with some kind of a trauma-based problem.
Yeah, it's really, the different tools, and we haven't researched the difference between those two methods, but they're both calming. They both get you into a really calm zone. And as Vanderkolk says, I mean, his theory as a psychiatrist is that you get somebody into that really calm zone, and they can very quickly integrate trauma, but you have to be able to get them into it. What I like about the alpha theta is you can actually see usually the time clearly, that there's a clear signature when they're in there and how long they're in there. I'm not sure that that's as clear using the bipolar montage, but you might be able to make arguments that you could. I think, you tend to use the toolbox you're most familiar with. And, I know Seaburn and Vanderkolk don't use alpha theta much. They use this other method of, using bipolar at C4, P4. And no doubt, both those areas have inputs, one to the reticular system and one to the amygdala, and there's good pathways there. So there's no doubt that you're changing coherence and phase between those pathways. And you're reducing certain electrical activity, and that could help people reset. Until we get more research, we're just not going to know for sure, but it's pretty obvious between the success that Seaburn's had and the success that I have had and Rob and others, that both methods are viable. And that's often the case. There's more than one way to hit a golf ball, a baseball. It's more than one way to go over the high jump. I tell the story when my dad took me to the Olympics when they came to New York long ago in ancient history, and everybody went over the high jump face first. And this other joker came out of nowhere, and he wanted to go over it backwards with his back towards the bar. And people used to laugh at him and jeer at him, and people were doing that, and we're sitting there. And right in front of us, this guy goes over backwards and does the world record. And we're all standing there with our jaws down, like, that's impossible. But it wasn't. It was just that everybody in sports was stuck on the way that, well, there's only one way to do this. It's and they were saying, well, the mechanics, the gravity, the human body's not meant to do it that way. I remember that, and that made an enduring effect. It's like, you can make all the arguments you want for something, but you have to remember it's tentative.
Fosbury flop. The Fosbury flop.
Is that what it's called? You
Yeah.
remember?
Fosbury. Yeah, sure. It was Mickey Mouse.
Richard, just curious, I know we've talked about this here, about the various montages back in the day of the early new mind mapping system. Have you ever had a chance to compare sessions done back then when we were using the bipolar montages compared to the 2-channel protocols that the map does today, to see if there was any difference in terms of anything?
Well, the only data I would have would be my own clients.
Yeah, and me too.
Back then. And you know, I was going by symptomology and not by EEG back then, and you were too.
Right.
And as I recall, we saw that they were fairly equivalent in their impact in terms of symptom change. But you know, and we were using the CEC and the at that time, and we were using the symptom tracker at that time. So we were empirically watching the results, and I remember our reviews. We concluded, well, these things look pretty much the same. We didn't run any heavy statistics on it, but it was uniform data, and I think you don't know for sure. My main concern is monopolar 2-channel as effective as what we were doing, because it's much more controllable. You can see what the coherence, the phase, symmetry live during the training. You can see what's happening. You can really investigate. You can't do that with the bipolar. And it was data that we could record and track on the internet, which we are doing now. We're seeing the outcomes of a training session, and we're gonna have to hire somebody new to do it, but we're gonna be able to query the data and say, this person used standard new mind protocol for this map, this was the outcome, is this the most efficient way to do it? I mean, that's a huge job. I just spent a year and a half running data on just some of the stuff that was critical questions. And I mean, I've got just hundreds of pages of Excel files, you know, that I'm putting together, and it's a huge job. Doing something like that is 10 times bigger.
Yeah.
So we'll have artificial intelligence. I have to bring on somebody who's an AI specialist to do that.
Yeah, because I probably have hundreds of people. We did those protocols on in the early days from when I was at the hospital, and that data is still there, obviously. And I remember when we changed over to the current mapping system and all that, and I just noted that people made continuously good progress. I didn't notice any difference. That's why I was curious if you had, because both seemed to work really well.
You know, and Siegfried, who was using bipolar at the time, said he really wanted to switch over to 2-channel for the very reason that I said, that you could track more closely what coherence and phase and amplitude were doing. And he said, it's like a black box. We don't know. If you had 2-channel, you could know. And I immediately thought, you know, he's right. He's a physicist. He's absolutely right. We really need to track this data closer if we're going to keep progressing and making improvements. So that's why we went that way.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, I was just curious.
No, good question. Good
Hey,
question.
Judy, if you ever want to putz around with those, I'll sit down with you and we'll do it.
I am interested.
You know how to
Okay.
reach me. Yep.
Okay, well, I'm going to go see if they got through the inauguration without a pitched battle, and then go to my next client.
It all went smooth.
Oh, good.
We have a new president, a new vice president. I saw part of it because it started at 11:30, a very glorious speech. And as far as I can see and understand, everything went quite nicely.
All right, the Republic survives. I hope we all
Yep.
learned from this lesson. And have a great week, and we'll get together Friday. Anything special Friday, Rob?
Nothing on the calendar for Friday. So if anybody has a map, or if you have follow-up questions to any of the presentations that have been here by Richard or Rusty, or general health ones, if you want to send them in early, we'll put you on the list and we'll get to yours first that way.
Okie doke. Sounds good, Rob.
All righty.
Have a good
Everybody,
rest of
we'll
the week.
see you Friday.
See you Friday.
Bye all.